Well, my name is Jeff Halper, and I'm the coordinator of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. We're an Israeli peace organization, been in existence now 10 years, that's dedicated to resisting the occupation and to bringing a just peace to Israel-Palestine. We're a number of Israelis who organized when Netanyahu was elected prime minister in 1996. And when that happened, it was clear that the Oslo peace process was in a state of decline. Netanyahu ran for office on an explicitly anti-peace process ticket. And after he was elected, the occupation began to reassert itself in very brutal ways. And the Israeli peace movement had become kind of dormant during the years of Rabin and Peres. And Netanyahu's election was our wake-up call. And so a number of us from about 8 different Israeli peace organizations got together and decided that the time had come to re-engage with resisting the occupation. One of the things we did is we went out and we talked to Palestinian activists to ask them what they thought were the issues that were most important for us to handle, to tackle. What was their agenda? How could we best work together? And the issue of house demolitions came up all the time. So by the time we had begun to organize our work, we discovered there were about more than 10,000 Palestinian homes that had been demolished in the occupied territory since 1967. Today, 10 years later, the figure is about 18,000 homes of innocent Palestinians that have been demolished by Israel in the occupied territories. So, because this is such a painful issue for the Palestinians, because almost every family has an experience with house demolitions, we took that as sort of the focal point of our work. In other words, each house demolition, whether it's done in a military sense or it's done by court order, because Israel doesn't grant building permits to Palestinians, so they have to build illegally if they build at all. Each demolition is a microcosm of the occupation. Why are they demolishing this particular house? Why are they demolishing in this area? What is the process, the legal means, or the military logic behind it? What is the process of demolitions contributing to the wider occupation? So each house demolition contains within it those issues that expose the way the wider occupation works. And so it's a very useful window into the occupation. It's also very important because Israel frames its occupation, or first of all, Israel denies that it has an occupation, formally. So it never uses the word occupation. But Israel frames the conflict purely as an issue of security, that Israel is defending itself, it's the victim, and the Palestinians are the perpetrators. Well, house demolition shows exactly the opposite, that these are not houses of people that had done any security offenses. They haven't been accused of terrorism. They've never been charged with anything. They're not put in jail. Israel never claims that house demolitions is because of terrorism. So that there's something else going on here. And it's that something else that we want to get at. That something else is a proactive Israeli claim to the entire country. And it's not defensive, it's not security-based, it's proactive. And then we discover you can't explain the demolition of Palestinian houses by security. There's no security element. You can't explain the expropriation of more than half the land of the occupied territories by Israel in terms of security. You can't explain the highway system that was built to link the settlements into Israel by security. You can't explain the settlements themselves. More than 300 settlements that have been built. You can't explain those by security. They weren't built for security. They were built, on the contrary, they're even anti-security because they nullify the West Bank as a buffer between Israel and Jordan, for example. So by moving its civilian population into the occupied territories, which is illegal under international law, Israel nullifies the security aspect of it. In other words, there's nothing of the occupation you can really explain by security. Not the uprooting of 1 million olive and fruit trees, not the closure policy of not only not allowing Palestinian workers to come into Israel to work, but most of the checkpoints are actually inside the occupied territories, not between the West Bank and Israel, but inside the little islands where the Palestinians are confined. You can't explain the internal closure of the occupied territories by security either. In other words, security is not the explanatory factor, and Israel is not defending itself. But so the house demolition issue, among others, gives us the opportunity to present an alternative view. And that's one in which Israel is a strong power, Israel is the occupying power, and therefore Israel can be held accountable for its actions. It's not fighting for its existence. This isn't an existential struggle, and therefore we demand that Israel be held accountable. So that on that level, the house demolition issue we use as a vehicle for ending the occupation. But on another level, of course, it allows us also to express our solidarity with the Palestinian people, because we resist the demolition of houses. We get in front of bulldozers, you know, that's why I'm built this way. You know, we chain ourselves in homes. You know, we try to delay demolitions while other activists are calling journalists, calling consulate people, and so on to try to stop the demolitions. And when houses are demolished, if the family is willing, we rebuild homes that have been demolished as acts of political resistance. This isn't humanitarian. We're a political organization, and these are acts of political resistance. And, and when we're rebuilding, we bring dozens of Israelis and Palestinians and international volunteers together at a building site to rebuild a home. So it's a very meaningful act of resistance, I think. It allows us to express our solidarity and support for these Palestinian families that are completely ruined financially. They're scared, they're intimidated, they have nowhere to live. And at the same time, like I said, it allows us to expose the way the occupation works, and to expose especially the lie behind Israel's framing, which says that this is a security issue.
How has your work evolved over the years? When we last spoke, when you were in Portland, Oregon in August 2003, you were beginning to suggest that the two-state solution to the conflict in Israel-Palestine was no longer viable, that there was going to be a transition from an anti-occupation movement to an anti-apartheid movement. What events took place that changed your perception of the problems here?
Well, it was actually in Portland that I wrote this article about warning what would happen if the roadmap initiative fails. In other words, we had supported the roadmap that was declared as an initiative in 2002 because we felt that it was a useful approach to the conflict. You know, it talked about the roadmap, which is the roadmap of the quartet, so-called, the United States, Europe, Russia, and the UN. And we thought it was useful, first of all, in that it takes the peacemaking out of the monopoly of the United States that has never been an honest broker. And it brings in other international players. We thought it was useful because it talks about ending the occupation. I mean, it uses the O word, you know, very explicitly. And it talks about a viable Palestinian state emerging, which is crucial, not just a Palestinian state, not just a Bantustan or some little prison mini-state or something, but a viable state, which we thought was important. And then it gave a very definite timetable. It wasn't open-ended like Oslo that could go on and on and on and nobody knows where you're going. The end game was there, a two-state solution, and the steps, the roadmap to how to get there was in place. So we thought it wasn't a bad plan. But what we saw already 2-3 years ago was that nobody was enforcing it. Nobody was following it. The quartet didn't take its own plan very seriously. And so I warned in that article that I'd written in Portland, actually, about the dangers of apartheid. And ever since then, we've been not only warning, but now we're actually in the process of developing an anti-apartheid campaign. Because we feel that, for the occupation is not going to go on and on and on. For Israel, there's an end to the process. And that is that the facts on the ground are in place, the settlements, the highway system. The West Bank has been essentially incorporated into Israel, together with Greater Jerusalem. In 2004, Israel got the approval of the United States, of the Bush government, to basically annex its major settlement blocks and to make the wall the new border of the country. So you're really taking a lot of the land from the Palestinians in the West Bank. You're confining them to little islands. So a Bantustan is emerging. And now the third stage is nailing it all down. And in May 2006, in this last year, Ulmer went to Washington when he was elected prime minister and presented to a joint session of Congress what he calls his convergence plan, which we consider a plan of apartheid, that truncates the West Bank and Gaza into little islands, leaves the Israeli settlements in place, the major settlements, removes from the Palestinians any borders, removes from them the water, removes from them their freedom of movement, removes from them Jerusalem, which is the economic center of any Palestinian state, and basically creates a prison state. And for that reason, we are moving now towards saying we are really right at the cusp, at the edge of apartheid. And that's the direction that we're kind of going right now.
You've focused your work on the occupied territories, the West Bank and Gaza, but within the Green Line, within the internationally recognized borders of Israel, there's approximately 20% of the population that are non-Jewish citizens of Israel. When you speak of apartheid, how does that, the experience of the 20% of Israeli citizens who are not Jewish, how does that fit into your understanding of the situation?
You know, we think that apartheid is the precise, accurate term. It's not just a slogan we're throwing out. Apartheid means separation. I mean, that's what apartheid means in Afrikaner, separation, which is what Israel calls its policy. We call it hafrada in Hebrew, which is separation. The official name of the wall is a separation barrier. So we talk about separation. Now, in South Africa, it was racial separation. Here, it's what we call demographic separation. It's separation of populations on an ethnic, religious, national basis. But nevertheless, there's separation of populations in which one population dominates the other. This is the other crucial aspect. In other words, a permanent regime, a system of structured domination of one of the groups over the other takes place. So it's a permanent regime of separation and domination. And that is exactly what Israel has created. Now, in a way, Israel's coming at it from another direction, because South Africa was one country. And when it established the apartheid regime, what it did was it took out pieces of its own country and made 10 Bantustans. 10 of these crazy little black African so-called countries. They were never recognized by the international community. But the point was to take then the black African population, shove them into these little Bantustans that were on 13% of the land of South Africa. South Africa gave up, let's say, 13% of its land to create these 10 Bantustans so that the other 87% would remain white and democratic. So it was, in a sense, that kind of an approach. Here it's the opposite. Here you're taking what were two systems, is the state of Israel and the occupied territories, you see, in which we and the Palestinians have always said we should end the occupation. In other words, we were always concerned about the expansion of Israel. So what Israel wants to do is coming from another direction than South Africa. It wants to create one unitary state. It wants an Israel that goes from the Mediterranean all the way to the Jordan Valley, to the Jordan River, that encompasses the Palestinian area, the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza. And then within that, then Israel carves out a Bantustan, because it's the same logic. South Africa couldn't digest the black African population. We can't digest the Palestinian population. So it's the same. In other words, it's the same end result. The end result is one system, which is called the apartheid system, in which you have a fiction of either a black African state or a Palestinian state existing within that encompassing apartheid system. So it's separation, but it's not, I mean, the two-state solution is separation as well, but it's not separation and domination. It's separation in which the Palestinians have a real state, if it was really the two-state solution. But here so in other words, you're talking about one state in which is a permanent domination of one population over another. Now, that affects especially the Palestinians in the occupied territories because they're not Israeli citizens. Palestinians living in Israel, who are Palestinian citizens, fall into a kind of a middle category. You know what? They're very much like the colored or the Asian populations were in South Africa. In other words, they're not white, they're not Jewish. This isn't their, even if they stay, they don't really have equal citizenship, but they're not black either. I mean, they're not going to go live in the Bantustan. They'll have Israeli citizenship. Like the Indians in South Africa or the Chinese or the Asians or so on, but it's not going to be an equal citizenship. So in a way, you'll have almost that same threefold division in Israel that you had in South Africa. You'll have a Jewish state encompassing the entire country. You'll have Palestinian citizens of the Jewish state who are second-class citizens, and then you'll have Palestinians who are citizens of a Palestinian Bantustan, which is not viable, is not sovereign, that exists only in a dependency upon Israel. So you really end up with the same system, even if you're kind of coming at it from a different direction.
What then is an alternative vision for the future of the region? What do groups like ICAHD envision as an alternative to occupation and apartheid?
Look, there's only two alternatives. One is a two-state solution. It's not a fair alternative. It's not a fair solution because the country isn't split half and half or anything near it. Palestinians, even in the ideal two-state solution, where Israel goes back completely to the borders that it had in 1967, and all the occupied territories revert to the Palestinians, they only get 22% of the country. So it still isn't a fair, but the Palestinians have indicated that they can live with that solution. They accept the two-state solution from that point of view, where Israel remains on 78% of the country, which is not a worst-case scenario for Israel. That could probably be made viable. In other words, even though the Palestinian state would be very small, they would have borders with Jordan and Egypt. They would have Jerusalem, Jerusalem would be their capital, but more important, Jerusalem would be integrated. This is where tourism is, which is by far the largest Palestinian industry. They'd have a good tourist industry. They'd have a coherent and fairly rich agricultural land. I mean, olives, for example, the olive industry is a very important one for the Palestinians. They'd have water. In other words, I think that they could, they'd have a seaport in Gaza. They'd have an airport. They have the fundamental, I think, requirements of a state. And then, of course, they would be in a relationship with Israel and with Jordan and the rest of the Arab world. And I think the Palestinian diaspora, which is very affluent, would really kick in and invest a lot. So that Palestinian state would be small, but I think it would be viable. The trouble is we're not going to have that, because you're never, ever going to get Israel. The international pressures are not there to force Israel back to those borders. And so that's where we're really stuck. We actually believe that the two-state solution is gone. Now, the international community is not ready to go there. And actually, neither are the Palestinians. Because most of the Palestinians that live here still look to the two-state solution. They still want a state of their own, some kind of self-determination. So I a little bit, what's the word, to couch that, and I say, well, I think it's gone, but if a small Palestinian state emerged, if there were two elements present, it still might work. One is that they would have to have unsupervised borders. They'd have to have borders with Jordan and with Egypt that are not supervised by Israel, something that Israel probably would not agree to. Otherwise, they really are a Bantustan disconnected from the rest of the Arab world. The second thing is they'd have to have Jerusalem integrated into the Palestinian state. Not a situation where Palestinian tour buses can go back and forth. You have that today in Bethlehem. They can go back and forth, but Bethlehem is dead economically because it's just an island that a couple tour buses come into every day and buy 10 cents worth of stuff and leave. I mean, people don't even stay in hotels there. You'd really have to have a Jerusalem that's an integrated part of a Palestinian state. If those two conditions were fulfilled, you know what? You could still make a case for it. If not, then I think the only other viable alternative is a one-state solution. But that seems to me absolutely a non-starter. I mean, I don't see the international community at all agreeing to dismantle Israel as a Jewish state. Or to put it another way, because Israel itself has made this one state. I mean, with Israeli settlements, Israel is the one that's expanded Israel out to the Jordan River. It isn't the Palestinians saying this is one state. Israel has said, Israel de facto has created one state. Now, if you want one state without apartheid, then Israel would have to transform itself from a Jewish state with an occupation or with apartheid or with a dependent, oppressed Palestinian population into a democratic state. And ironically, as good as that sounds, and here Bush has dedicated his presidency to spreading freedom and democracy throughout the world, the idea that the prospect that Israel, the one state that Israel has created, become a democratic state for all its citizens is just a non-starter. The international community, with the United States at the head, is not going to support that. So I don't know. I don't know. I think that we're going into a very, very difficult time, and it could be that we'll have to go into apartheid before it becomes clear to everybody that the two-state solution is gone, and then to have an anti-apartheid struggle in which the result will either be a two-state solution or a one-state solution. It will probably, unfortunately, the descent into apartheid is probably unavoidable. That's the good news.
What about something that Noam Chomsky used to discuss and even mentioned in his recent book, Failed States? And that's the proposal of some form of binationalism within the one-state framework. Is that a proposal that you've given some thought to?
No, we've given thought to that. I've given thought to that. I don't think it could work. I mean, it's true you have two nations living here. I mean, first of all, binational states have never been a happy story. I mean, there's very few binational states that where they really get along well. Maybe one of the best is Belgium. And Belgium has some serious tensions as well. It's not really binational, but it's bilingual in that sense. Binational states don't work very well because nations are the irreducible collective. In other words, no nation can live under another nation. What nations have a right for, in a sense, and what nations demand is self-determination, their own rule, that they determine their own fate, you see. And therefore, any binational state where you try to share a state, you try to share power, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. I mean, you can see it with Lebanon, you can see it with Sri Lanka, you can see it with Cyprus, you can see it in a lot of places. The other problem with that model is that where you do have binational states, each national group normally has a discrete part of the country. You know, you've got the, in Canada, you've got French-speaking Canada, and then the English-speaking Canada. You've got the Flemish-speaking here and the French-speaking there. You've got the Tamils here and you have the Sinhalese there. You've got, you know, in other words, you've got each national group has a discrete territory and then they come together in some ways. You have the Christians in the north and the Muslims in the south in Lebanon. Here, everybody's so intertwined. You know, you got 500,000 Israelis living in the settlements in the Palestinian areas. You've got 1,300,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel living throughout Israel. You don't have those discrete, it's not like, you know, here are the Jews and here are the Palestinians, that you can then, each one has its turf, at least turf within a common state. You don't have that because it's all too mixed up. So I think for both of those reasons, I mean, if you're going to go the one-state route, I think it has to be like South Africa did. I mean, there was a lot of pressure in South Africa to become a kind of at least a tri-national state. In other words, the Afrikaners saw themselves as a nation. The Zulu saw themselves as a nation, did not want to go into one democratic state. And then you had other smaller groups, but they pretty much agreed, whether they're Europeans or the Asians or the Coloreds or a lot of the other black African groups weren't as national based as the Zulu and the Afrikaners. But South Africa made the decision that we're going to be a democratic unitary state and impose that. I mean, ironically, today there's a kind of an alliance between the Afrikaners and the Zulu. But nevertheless, they've accepted that because it just, even though in South Africa you did have probably a better situation than here, from the point of view of different groups having their distinct territories, they went for a unitary democratic state. And I think that's the only model that would work here. The problem is that, again, what would be the national expression for Palestinians and for Israeli Jews in one state? That's the big, one state sounds good. I like it. It's a challenge. It's just in some ways. But you can't ignore this national element. We're not ethnic groups. There isn't some, like in the United States, you've got the United States is a national state level identity that encompasses, it's neutral in a sense. I mean, maybe the militia in Montana don't think so, but basically it's neutral, you know, and everybody can become, the United States doesn't belong to any particular group. You know, here, you know, and therefore everybody living in the United States, except maybe the Native Americans, but everybody else living in the United States is ethnic. In other words, they say we want to retain more or less our cultural traditions and our identities, and we want to be hyphenated Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, Polish Americans, Jewish Americans, whatever, Hispanic Americans, but we're hyphenated. In other words, we're Americans of different varieties, different ethnic groups. And you can have that in the States because the ethnic groups don't claim to be nations. They don't claim to self-determination. That's the difference. Ethnic group says, no, our self-determination is as Americans. And then our ethnic, but the United States is pluralistic, so that the different groups want some kind of cultural expression, but not more than that. Here you don't have that. Here you've got two nations living in the same, we're not ethnic groups. And that makes the dynamic, I think, much more difficult.
I'd like to turn to the broader context, something that I've been uncomfortable dealing with, but that is very much a part of the vocabulary of the debate over the occupation, at least in the United States. That's the concept of Zionism. Typically, those who support the occupation are described as Zionists, and those who oppose the occupation as anti-Zionists. Now, I'm putting a gloss on something that's far more complex than that.
A big gloss.
That's what I'd like to explore. Can you talk a little bit about Zionism? Is it synonymous with Jewish nationalism? How can we speak of this idea, this concept, that does justice to these issues?
You know, Israel is a country in which the ideology preceded the state. You know, there was a Zionist movement before there was a state of Israel. And so I think one of the struggles today that we have in Israel is, and it doesn't have to do so much with the occupation, it's actually internal Israeli struggle, is, are we a state that belongs to the Jewish people? Is this a Jewish state, which is the Zionist conception? Or is Israel a state that belongs to all its citizens, like any other Western democracy? You know, is it a country that belongs to its inhabitants, or is it a country that belongs to a particular group of its inhabitants, the Jews? And that's a real tension because if this is a Jewish country, the non-Jews are by definition left out, or they're second class. We have to remember that the Jewish population here is only about 70%. Probably 30% of Israelis, I mean, I'm not talking about the occupied territories, inside Israel, are not Jewish. They're either Palestinian citizens of Israel, or they're Russian immigrants. Probably 300,000 to 400,000 that aren't Jewish and aren't going to become Jewish. Or there's a lot of Israeli Jews that have emigrated, you know. And then there's a lot of others. There's Ethiopians, there's foreign workers, there's a lot of other groups here as well. So one of the questions is, can a country belong to 70% of its population and still be called democratic? In fact, instead of a democracy, the term we use, it's kind of a jargony term, is an ethnocracy. The concept of an ethnocracy means a country that belongs to a particular ethnic group or a particular national group. And Israel is an ethnocracy. It is not a democracy. So that's a real struggle we have. Now, in terms of the occupation, it doesn't break down that way because there are a lot of groups that oppose the occupation, like Peace Now or Meretz, or even the Labour Party, who are very Zionistic. In other words, they define Israel as within those 1967 borders. They still have a big problem. They still don't know what to do with the 30% exactly that aren't Jewish in Israel. I mean, but without the occupied territories, it's easier for them to talk about if there's a Palestinian state there, then there can be a Jewish state here. And if there is Palestinian or Arab, as we say, citizens of Israel, if they don't want to be second-class citizens in a Jewish state, they have the option to go to a Palestinian state. It's kind of that. It's fakey, but that's kind of the idea. I think groups like ours, we don't define ourselves by Zionism at all. I think essentially we're Israeli. Just like, you know, there's American groups and French groups and Chinese groups. You know, France isn't determined by some ideology. France is a country. And it has citizens, and a lot of people become citizens, and it's a real place. I mean, there is French ideology, there's French history, there's churches in France. I mean, there are those things, but they don't define France. And that's the way we approach Israel. We say we're Israelis. We want a country that's democratic, belongs to everybody. It shouldn't belong to any particular group. Zionism was an important historical element. I mean, the country wouldn't have arisen without Zionism. Maybe it shouldn't have arisen, but it did. Zionism had a certain vision of the country. It had certain values. There's songs, there's literature, there's institutions. A lot of things came out of Zionism. But Zionism can't define a country. You can't freeze a country and have it defined. A lot of things happen. Countries evolve. Countries are alive. They change. And they have to have the right to evolve. You can't keep them confined. That's what we're saying. So that a lot of things happened that Zionism never could have predicted. For example, 75% of the Jews never came to Israel. You know, well, Zionism thought everybody, all the Jews were going to come. So now you have not only a state, but a state with an occupation on a narrow base of 25% of the Jewish people. There's not enough Jews. Well, you couldn't have predicted that. Nobody could have predicted 1948, what happened. Nobody could have predicted 67 with the occupation and settlements and what that does. Nobody could have predicted the fall of the Soviet Union and all the non-Jewish Russians that came here and all the Russian Jews that went to the United States or Germany. In other words, demographic things, the rise of a Palestinian population inside Israel from 150,000 in 1948, after 80% had been driven out, 150,000 Palestinians got citizenship in Israel in 48. Now there's 1.3 million. So a lot of things change in the country, and you have to give the country the right to evolve and change. I mean, the United States of George Bush is not the United States of George Washington. I don't think George Washington could have predicted George Bush, which is okay. You know, countries change in good ways, bad ways, whatever. And that's what we're saying, that Israel's a real country, and that you can be sympathetic to Zionism, you can like Zionism, not like Zionism, but Zionism doesn't determine anymore. It shouldn't determine what Israel is. And what should determine what Israel is two things. First of all, its citizens. The citizens of the country, all of them, together as equal citizens, should determine policies of the country and the way it's structured and all of that. And the second thing is its right to find its place in the Middle East. You know, now we mean that by that partly getting rid of the occupation. I mean, you can argue occupation for security reasons. From our point of view, you can't argue it from Zionist reasons. You can't say that the land belongs to us. That's illegitimate. So in other words, what we're saying is we're not defined by Zionism. We're defined by being Israelis. Israel's a real country. Most Israelis and most Jews abroad can't get their head around that yet. They haven't gotten there. They're still very defensive and very threatened when you talk about Israel without saying Jewish right away. You see, and so I think it's in a sense, I think there's a war going on, a cultural war, a political war between those who define Israel by Zionism and those who define Israel, you know, as a real country. And so when people say to us, are you a Zionist group, anti-Zionist, post-Zionist, I say Zionism doesn't mean anything to me. I mean, are you a Hamiltonian Democrat or a Jeffersonian Democrat? I mean, that was a very important discussion 200 years ago. Today, it's irrelevant. I mean, nobody even knows what a Hamiltonian Democrat means anymore. And it's the same thing. I think we're looking forward to the time when I don't even know what a Zionist means. You know, you can be Israeli, you can be conservative or liberal or religious or secular or this or that, but where Zionism isn't the determining element.
But it's been more complex in my experience than to merely say that those who identify themselves as Zionists necessarily support ethnocracy for the State of Israel. My impression is that there are Zionists, people who self-identify as Zionists, but who would support Israel as being a nation of its citizens.
You can't. They're contradictory. Look, we call Israel here a Jewish democracy. That's a contradiction in terms. You can't be a Jewish democracy. You're either a democracy or you're not a democracy. You're either a democracy or you're an ethnocracy. A democracy means a country belongs to its citizens. And citizenship is equal. It isn't first class, second class, better. It's an equal citizenship. That is essentially in contradiction to the idea of a Jewish state. I mean, they just can't put them together. Now, American Jews try to do that. Jews that are far away from here say, well, you know, because they don't really know and they're not plugged into Israel. So they get this idea of saying, well, someday I might be a refugee, I might want to go to Israel, and I want there to be a Jewish state. I mean, it's very abstract for them. They're not going to come here, by the way, because in the whole history of Israel, when there was an emergency and Jews had to go somewhere, if they had a choice, they didn't come to Israel. You know, the Jews of North Africa, those that could, the middle classes, went to France or French-speaking Canada. The Jews of Iraq, the middle class, went to England. The Jews of Persia, of Iran, went to California. You know, the Jews of South Africa that are leaving today, those that, you know, are going to the United States or Australia. The Jews of Argentina, when the economy collapsed, went to Mexico. You know, the Jews of Russia, when the Soviet Union collapsed, went to the United States and Germany. The ones that don't have a choice, the poor ones, or even in my family, my wife's family, you know, her family came here because they were poor. Those in her family that could afford to went to the States. So, you know, there's all this thing also about this is going to be a refuge for us. If the Jews, if anything ever threatens the Jews, they'll go to Canada or Australia or Great Britain before they come to Israel. Believe me. Only 1% of American Jews actually came to Israel. There's 60,000 American, like me, American Jews living in Israel out of 6 million people, 6 million Jews in the States. So that's that. But you see, all that's on a very general level because you don't have to mean it. It doesn't affect your life. And you can say it without thinking about it. But if you really think about it, and you're a Jew abroad, and what defines Jews abroad is their commitment to civil rights and human rights and equality. I mean, that's, if anything defines most Jews abroad, it's that liberalism. If they really knew what a Jewish state meant in terms of structured inequalities and apartheid and second class, I mean, it violates every single principle and value that they hold as Jews in the United States. But they don't have to think about it because it's very abstract, and then it kind of fits into their ethnic identity thing. It doesn't really have to do with Israel itself. So it's not a real issue for Jews in the States. It's kind of there, and they don't feel that kind of a disconnect. So that here in Israel, I think, is where this is a real issue, and this is where it has to be played out.
Several Israelis have commented on how militarism and the occupation have damaged the institutions of this society. Are there elements that stand out for you when you think about the impact of the occupation on Israeli society?
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the slogans of Peace Now, we're not great Peace Now fans, but one of their slogans is the occupation corrupts, which is true. I mean, you know, during the Lebanon War a few months ago, Olmert got up in the Knesset, in the parliament, and said, we have a right to be normal. Like any other people in the world, we have a right to be normal. Well, you see, that's the illusion that we try to talk about with the Israelis. You can't be normal. You can't expect to have a normal, healthy, prosperous, moral society and have an occupation. You can't have a democracy here and occupation there. You know, you can't insulate yourself. That's what Israelis try to do. They try to create a kind of a membrane, a kind of a bubble around themselves that insulates them from the Arabs and from the occupation and so on. But they get frustrated because it comes through all the time. There's terrorist attacks. They can't pacify the Arabs. They can't, you know, they get Hezbollah that attacks, you get Qassam rockets, I mean, they can't insulate themselves. And then the idea that you're insulated, that you're living in a cocoon, and that somehow, even if you could keep it all out, the idea that that's normal, that you got a 26-foot concrete wall around your country, that's normal, you know, it's crazy. So that's the problem, is that the Israelis are desperate to be normal. And they don't see how the occupation permeates every single aspect of their lives. And it's not only the legal system. And there's been a lot of books about how the Supreme Court has legitimized torture, it's legitimized house demolitions, land expropriation, the worst things. But it's also corrupting in a lot of other ways. You know, it's corrupting economically, where you live off cheap labor. You know, it's corrupting, you know, from the point of view of brutality towards others. You know, you become very hardened. You know, you send your 18, 19-year-old kids out to sit in checkpoints or hunt Palestinians at night or break into houses. That has to have an effect. In fact, the way that the occupation's impacted on Israel hasn't been researched. There's been a tremendous rise in the last few years in domestic violence. A lot of women getting killed by their husbands, their brothers, their lovers, their boyfriends, or whatever. There's a big rise in alcoholism. There's a huge rise in the suicide rate. You know, the more Israeli soldiers die by suicide than in combat. So, you know, I think this affects Israeli society in a lot of ways that's repressed, that isn't talked about. So there's no research that's done, people don't talk about it. So I think from every level, from the institutional level to the moral level to the actual everyday level, the occupation is corrupting Israeli society. But not enough that people still don't have the illusion that they can live a more or less normal life. I mean, it's true, terrorism has been brought down to a manageable level. So for Israelis, if there's 1, 2, 3 terrorist attacks a year, that's manageable. We can deal. We don't expect absolute peace. The Israeli economy is doing very well. Tourism's coming back. So if you kind of look at it like that, everything's okay. We have good relations with Europe. We have great relations with the United States. Things are okay. When you get into the more problematic areas, mental health and quality of life and so on, you prefer not to dig too much. You kind of just you put a lid on that. And in that way, I think Israelis feel they can keep going on for as long as it takes. I'm not so sure. There's 750,000 Israelis that have emigrated, that have left the country. So, you know, I'm not so sure that it doesn't take its toll, but it's you know, the British have this stiff upper lip idea. And in Israel too, you're supposed to take it, you're not supposed to complain. And so I think it's very repressed. And I think the occupation has much more of an effect on Israel than is admitted. But we're not going to admit it because that means we have to give it up.
Is there any other topics that you'd like to mention before we wrap this up?
The only other point I wanted to make was about civil society. These are terms that aren't used in the States very much. They're more European terms. But we believe that the people have to play a key role in bringing peace to this area. I think if there's an iron law of politics, it's that states will not do the right thing unless they're pushed by the people. I don't think they'll ever do the right thing if they're not pushed by the people. And therefore, we can't get through to the Israeli public for all the reasons we talked about. We try to work with governments, but you know, they'll give you 10 minutes, but you're not a decision maker. And therefore, we try to work very much with the hundreds of grassroots organizations all over the world that are involved with this issue. Church groups, human rights groups, political groups, Jewish groups, Palestine solidarity groups. I mean, there's a lot of unions, trade unions, intellectuals, students. And that's what gives us a sense of optimism, is that this is becoming, I think, the issue in the world. It's becoming a global issue, something like apartheid in South Africa was. And it's not going to go away. And I think that is, I think in the Muslim world as well, Muslim civil society is not going to let this go. This, for them, is the microcosm of American imperialism, of Western neocolonialism, the humiliation of Islam. This is the hot battleground. Really is the clash of civilizations from the Muslim point of view in this country. So that we're trying very hard, you know, we're marginal in Israeli society as a small critical peace movement, but we really feel that we have a voice in the wider world, in the civil society, And if we can mobilize civil society to then pressure their governments, to then pressure Israel, we have a chance to win this thing. So from that point of view, I think we're optimistic. And what we do have at our disposal that you didn't have so much in the anti-apartheid days is the whole concept of human rights. Human rights has become much more a part of the public consciousness. You've got the International Court of Justice, you've got the International Criminal Court, we've got institutions, we have world social forums, we have the internet, we're more in touch with each other. And so I think that if I had a message, it would be that we really have to redouble our actions as an international civil society to see the end of the occupation.
You've been watching an interview with Jeff Halper. Jeff Halper is the coordinator of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, ICAHD, a nonviolent direct action group originally established to oppose and resist Israeli demolition of Palestinian houses in the occupied territories. Today, ICAHD is active in opposing land expropriation, settlement expansion, bypass road construction, the Israeli policies of closure and separation, the wholesale uprooting of fruit and olive trees, and more. In addition, Jeff Halper writes and speaks widely on the Israeli occupation and the struggle for human rights and civil rights in the region. His most recent essay, The Problem with Israel, is available through the ICAHD website. If you'd like to find out more about the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, please visit their website at www.icahd.org. That's www.icahd.org. If you'd like to find out more about this program, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You can see and hear this program as streaming video and audio, and you'll also find interviews with Ali Abunimah, Phyllis Bennis, Ilan Pape, and many others. This program has been a production of PDX Justice Media Productions. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting public access cable television, net neutrality, and all forms of grassroots, democratic community media.